Well, Cassidy Caron is the past president of the Métis National Council. She met Pope Francis in 2022, both here in Canada and at the Vatican. Cassidy, good to see you again. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
Listen, you led the Métis delegation to the Vatican, and that was in March of 2022. You met with Pope Francis along with elders and residential school survivors, and you were calling on him at the time to come to Canada. How open was he to hear your stories and your concerns?
When we met with Pope Francis at the Vatican, we really shared all of that time with our Métis residential school survivors to share their stories with him so that he had an understanding of what they had gone through, what they had endured. And we really hoped that he would listen. And then we called upon him to provide an apology to residential school survivors on behalf of the Catholic Church. Of course, a couple of days later, he did provide that apology at the Vatican itself. But our survivors wanted that apology here on Canadian soil. And so when we were sharing those stories, what really struck me was the humanity of Pope Francis. You could tell he was truly listening and that he was really struck by the stories of our residential school survivors. And when he spoke his apology on April 1st, 2022, he talked about action and that it needed to be followed by action. And at that time, he did make the promise that he would come to Canada to deliver that apology once again on Canadian soil. And of course, a few months later, he did just that. He made his penitential pilgrimage to Canada, making 3 stops along the way and delivering a similar but different apology at each one of those stops. So that was really meaningful, and I do feel as though it was because he heard those survivors and he felt their hurt, their trauma, and I always just take the time to really thank and honor those residential school survivors for their bravery, their courage, for sharing such hurtful stories directly to the Pope.
And you saw the impact that apology had when he was going across the country, the many survivors who were brought to tears with the apology. He would go on to agree that residential schools amounted to cultural genocide. Months later, he would denounce the doctrine of discovery, the doctrine that essentially gave the theological argument for colonization. What did that do for reconciliation in this country, do you think?
It really promoted reconciliation to a great extent. First and foremost, when we were in Rome at the Vatican, for the amount of media attention that drew was massive. To be able to educate the masses on residential schools, on the harms of residential schools and the role of the Catholic Church, that played a significant role in reconciliation. And then to see, the Catholic Church and Canadians, Catholics, continue on that journey throughout the next few months while Pope Francis was planning his penitential pilgrimage, it really kept the ball rolling on reconciliation. Sometimes within Canada, we see issues, get quite large, get a lot of attention, and play a big role in the fabric of our society, but then it just disappears. And so for Pope Francis to continue the conversation throughout those months, and then, like you say, as he was leaving Canada, he made that announcement that residential schools did amount to cultural genocide. He had that conversation then rise to the top of our consciousness. And then a few months later, again, denounce the doctrine of discovery. To continue that conversation throughout many months, throughout over a year, I would say, it helps make sure that the issues don't fall to the wayside and don't get taken over by other issues within Canada, because reconciliation does not start and does not finish with an apology. It really has to be followed by concrete action, and we need to continue to see that action in the coming months, the coming years, and generations.
How would you concretely describe what you'd like to see going forward, though? Because, even when Pope Francis was here in Canada, there was the talk how it was the beginning of the process, not the end of the process. So where else would you like to see the action move, given the history and what Pope Francis did in terms of reconciliation for this country?
So I wrote about some of my reflections in the Toronto Star this morning. Those reflections go back to the apology that Pope Francis delivered on April 1st at the Vatican. He tasked the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops, the bishops here in Canada, to really carry forward the action of reconciliation on the ground here in Canada. While I was the president of the Métis National Council for the last 3 years, unfortunately, once Pope Francis went back home after his journey here to Canada, I didn't see that action continue from the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops. It's really important that, the call that Pope Francis provided to them continues. And what that action looks like is going to be different all across the country. It's going to be different for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. Reconciliation starts with a conversation. It starts with, wondering what is necessary with these communities. For the Métis Nation specifically, we were calling for truth, justice, healing, and reconciliation. And there's actions that have been identified within all 4 of those values. It starts with acknowledging that Métis went to residential schools and that they need to have that recognition and that justice, that compensation, that recognition, and it's different for everyone. So it's all about conversations, and really, Pope Francis tasked the bishops here in Canada with that work, and I really do hope that, with the passing of Pope Francis, that it's a renewed call for action, and that there will be more conversation moving forward.
Cassidy Caron, I always appreciate the time. Thank you for this.
Thank you very much.
Well, let's continue the conversation now with His Excellency William McGrattan, Bishop of Calgary, also President of the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops. Excellency, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Michael, as well.
Now, I will be very honest with you. I did not expect to hear what we just heard from Cassidy Caron, but you heard what she said about where she'd like to see reconciliation move forward. How would you answer what we just heard from the former president of the Métis National Council?
In some ways, I appreciate Cassidy's recollection, and especially her work at the time with her and the other leaders of the Inuit and First Nations. I think that delegation, first going to Rome, and Pope Francis having the opportunity to personally listen to the impact of residential schools, really, I think, was the turning point to see that this was important, and he saw that the bishops who were present as well for those meetings, he tasked us with being committed to that. It is a long process, and I also acknowledge that there is more work to be done, as Cassidy mentioned. As well, I would say that we have, as a conference, been restructuring our Indigenous Council, making sure that those voices are much more present in our deliberations and discussions. Also, I would point to the Indigenous Reconciliation Fund, the collection and the commitment of over 30 million here that continues to sort of be directed towards these projects of healing, of education, of the recovery of culture and spirituality that Pope Francis mentioned, was obviously the travesty of the residential school system. That the cultural language, the cultural heritage of these peoples, the Indigenous, were affected through that form of education and colonization. There is work to be done, but I'm grateful to her understanding of how impactful and historic his visit here to Canada was, and that, yes, he set the direction and the path for us as a church, and I think Canadian society, to continue that penitential pilgrimage with our First Nations, our Inuit and Métis brothers and sisters.
So a direction and a path. Is it fair to say then that you believe that the spirit of reconciliation, its priority for the conference, remains today?
I would say it does. As we say, sometimes we look for immediate results or signs of fruits of that. But as I pointed, I do believe that there was the desire, and the invitation has always been there for the conference to continue this dialogue with the leaders of the Métis, the First Nations. Those continued as we developed letters of apology and commitment to the TRC following the visit of Pope Francis. So there was always been, I think, a spirit of wanting to walk together and a spirit of collaboration, that we needed to both commit to this path, but also to educate Canadians together, so that it wasn't just simply the voice of the church, but we were first listening to our First Nations, our Indigenous, our Métis brothers and sisters. This was important, and it continues to be important at the local level as well for each bishop.
Now, you did release a statement today on the passing of Pope Francis, and in it, you note the following, that Francis, he advanced, you say, the Church's ongoing commitment to address sexual abuse in meeting with victims around the world in order to promote both justice and healing in their lives. You know, sexual abuse is a reason many Catholics have left the Church. It is also what critics say against the Church. How did Francis change that dialogue, and how is that being addressed right now?
Well, I think we know that Pope Francis' heart was to those who found themselves in situations of injustice, suffering, and of course, at the hands of those individuals within the Church. And so his commitment to offer apologies in many of the visits that he has undertaken in his pontificate, he made a priority of meeting with victims, listening as well to their stories, and offering his personal apology. The protection of minors has become a very important reality, and many of the changes with regard to reporting, ensuring that bishops and the Church are following procedures of justice, making sure that we are sensitive to the voice of victims. This has all been under the leadership of Pope Francis. And also Cardinal O'Malley, who has been instrumental in this whole area, having been asked by Pope Francis to take on this very important area of work, of healing, of making sure that the Church is not necessarily just sensitive and trying to protect, but actually trying to address that past history and pain of those victims of sexual abuse.
Now, Pope Francis also worked for a more inclusive church, the 2S LGBTQ community, divorced people, single unwed mothers. Is there a place in the church still for those groups without Pope Francis?
I believe that he set the path in the synodal gatherings in the last 2 years, where many of these conversations and these voices, the role of women, those who are marginalized because of their sexual orientation, those who are disadvantaged because of political situations, especially also the young. He was very sensitive to how society and culture was sometimes adversely affecting the young people. So I think the path of synodality is a path and going to be a legacy that Pope Francis says that these voices, those individuals within the Church, should have the opportunity to enter into this dialogue, and for us to have a sense of listening and to understand where and how the Church can continue to walk with them.
So in terms of the inclusiveness, it's still a path that's open without conclusion? Is that what you're saying?
Well, this is, but my experience in this last synod is that those conversations, that dialogue, Pope Francis has recognized, and I think the synod process and the final document also addresses that particular area. The Church needs to be sensitive, needs to be open to listen, and that path forward can only be a path that is one of dialogue.
Now, Bishop, I'm going to ask you a question here. You know, as a Catholic, less a bishop, but as a Catholic, what lessons will you carry from the life of Pope Francis?
I think for me, in my experience, and I guess I would have to take off my mitre and my hat as the bishop, but is his humanity. Often I witnessed that in the delegation where he met with those individuals. I saw someone who was truly concerned, a father figure, and also to us as bishops, even though we did not speak during those meetings, we were silent. He spoke to us at the end, And he was very encouraging to say, I see the spirit of unity. I see the spirit of us wanting to walk as bishops with our Indigenous. And I really saw in him someone who had words of encouragement for those who are facing difficult situations and difficult paths. So, you know, as an individual, as a Catholic, I saw his words of encouragement to give strength and courage for those who are facing paths maybe of great challenge. And so I took that as a lesson of his own humanity and how he interacted just personally with individuals. And his heart was always open to receive anyone. And that was very evident throughout his entire life and his pontificate.
Bishop McGrattan, I appreciate the time this evening. Thank you for that.
Thank you very much, Michael.